You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at Egypt's presidential election. A cartoon in an Egyptian newspaper shows a perplexed family huddled in front of a television set. Written on the screen is a phrase that perhaps sums up the national mood. It says, "We wish to inform our dear viewers that we don't understand what is happening either, that nobody knows what is going on, and nobody has a clue what the hell is coming next." 16 months after the Tahrir Square protests began, and Egyptian politics appears far from revolutionary. Sure, ousted President Hosni Mubarak is now serving a life sentence, and decades of emergency rule have come to an end. But many Egyptians are disappointed with the two candidates who have made it to this weekend's runoff presidential vote. One is the Mubarak-era military figure, Ahmed Shafiq, who promises security and leadership that is reminiscent of the dictatorship years. The other candidate is the Muslim Brotherhood's Mohammed Morsi. He's clearly not the first choice for many women secularists or Coptic Christians. So, how did what appeared to be a liberal secular revolution end up like this? Is the Mubarak state really a thing of the past? And what is in Egypt's future? To probe these questions, we're hosting a discussion in our London studio. I'm joined by Nabila Ramdani, the journalist and commentator, Reem Abu al-Fadl, a research fellow from Oxford University, Ilya Fabrichnikov, an independent analyst on the line from Moscow, and Omar Ashur from Exeter University, who's joining us today from Cairo. Okay, to get the ball rolling, I'd like to get a single sentence answer from each of you to the following question. First of all, from you, Nabila, who should be Egypt's next president and why?
It will make sense to the Egyptian people that a former member of the Mubarak regime, which have obviously strong ties with the old structure, should not be representative of the new Egypt.
And Reem?
I don't think we're in a position to say who the next president should be because the people haven't been asked properly. And we need to restart not only the electoral process, but actually the so-called transition to find out. Definitely the indications are that it's neither Shafiq nor Morsi.
And Ilya?
Definitely it's for Egyptian people to decide. But what we're witnessing here is a rift between different political parties. So obviously there has been a sign that the Egyptian public is not satisfied with the results of both revolution and the election protest. And obviously that the appearance of the former Mubarak administration figure is definitely the reflection of those controversies within the Egyptian society.
And Omar, you're in Cairo. What's the latest from there? What do you think about this?
In Cairo, I think it's the ultimate say has to be to the Egyptian people as well. The Egyptians, I think, 16 million voted for pro-change, whether for revolutionary change or for pro-change Islamist candidate like Dr. Mohammed Morsi. So the overwhelming majority voted revolution, voted change. Some voted for Shafiq for a continuation of Mubarak regime, and we can discuss why that happened and how did it develop. But right now, I think we have two choices that are quite clear. And if the runoff ran without rigging, without fight and intervention, I think we may see Mohammed Morsi winning this election.
Okay, I'll put that one back to Nabila. When I asked you the question, you said that a leader from the Mubarak regime should not be allowed to stand. Does that mean that you favour Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood candidate?
It's very much up to the Egyptian people to choose, and they are very much doing that. But there are fears in Egypt that a former member of Mubarak's regime, and if Shafiq is elected, that he will keep the old system intact and he won't challenge the military grip on politics, and that's a major concern. But at the same time, it seems that there is a straight choice between a former member of the Mubarak regime and an Islamist candidate on the other hand. It was very clear the results of the latest parliamentary elections elected massively. The people gave their trust to Islamic parties, which are now overwhelmingly ruling parliament. So it wouldn't surprise me that an Islamist ends up as president. But equally, there are other concerns. Some people are saying that they will worry that Islamists will impose an equally authoritarian system, but based on religion. So there are concerns about the two candidates.
Reem, are you part of a group of Egyptians that feels that both of these candidates are not exactly what you wanted? And you said that Egyptians haven't been asked the question properly.
There's a lot of focus right now on the elections themselves and procedure, but really this transitional process began last March, and it began in a very imbalanced way. The military council has since then pursued what some people in Egypt are calling a soft coup against the revolution. They began with this divide and rule strategy. They began with a referendum on some constitutional amendments that they then surpassed with a declaration. And this sort of yes-no polarization was then allowed to create a crack in the revolutionary camp, which, as Ahmed rightly said, is by all indications the majority's choice. And since then, we can talk about all the different points at which a mixture of violence and military council propaganda has been used to discredit the revolution. And that's why I don't think either of the elections can really be seen as a proper enfranchisement of the Egyptian people and a proper choice that they've been given. Shafiq should not have been running in this race, even if I accept, which I don't, the framework in which they were brought about. And the latest indication yesterday is that the second round will be subject to violations, because yesterday the Ministry of Justice issued a decree allowing military police and military intelligence to arrest civilians for a number of rather vague offences, including stopping traffic, which is clearly aimed at protests. Add to that the military council's recent declarations urging Egyptians to fulfil their national mission and vote. All of these calls on the Egyptian people to rally around and vote and then accept the consequences don't, for me, signal any sort of faith in this system. And that's why you have had a drop in voter participation, actually, since the parliamentary elections, and a drop in faith in the Islamist parties that supposedly won last November.
Omar, you're in Cairo. Perhaps you can give us a little bit more on this. How widespread is this feeling that Reem's describing among Egyptians that the candidates that they're being offered for this runoff vote over the weekend don't reflect the spirit of the revolution that toppled Mubarak?
We divide it into the Islamist camp and the sympathizers, and then you have the what I call the Tahririst camp, and it's the supporters and sympathizers, and then the ones who oppose previous status quo camp, which is, I believe, they're quite a minority, and the ones who want to go with the daily life, as usual, the economy, better jobs, which are, I think, the majority in Egypt. And sometimes people call them the couch party or the Canada party, because they don't participate much in activism. For the Islamists, it's very clear for them. It's mostly, for them, Shafiq is the guy who is the torturer, the guy who used to storm their houses at 3 a.m., take them from their wives, strip them naked, and then electrocute them. So for them, they are very determined that if you want change, if you want revolution, if you want some kind of justice in this country, then you have to go for Morsi. Cairo is really, it's quite critical, but outside of Cairo, the perceptions are very different. And I've been touring a bit in Delta and in the Upper Egypt, and the reactions there is, among the Islamists especially, is very, very strong. But also the reactions for the pro-Shafiq guys, especially among the ones who were affiliated with the NDP, who were beneficiaries from the National Democratic Party of Mubarak, and who are beneficiaries from the party, is very strong for Shafiq. And I was attending this rally for Morsi that got attacked by Shafiq supporters with Molotov cocktails and stones. And so the situation outside of Cairo is very, very tense. So it's a very diversified picture, but I think what remains quite constant is that the Egyptian people don't want to go back there. The overwhelming majority don't want to go back to the times of Mubarak, but many of them are worried about the costs of the revolution as well.
Ilya Fabrichnikov over in Moscow, the independent analyst. Can I get your perspective, the perspective from Moscow, of the state of the revolution in Egypt and what happened to it?
Definitely you have to dissect the current state of the affairs in Egypt from what was happening in Tahrir some time ago. And you have to make a difference between the political process and the current state of civil society in Egypt, because after 30 years of Mubarak rule, what I think is that definitely there was no formulated civil society in Egypt. So what we have seen in Tahrir is definitely the pioneers of civil society in Egypt. And what they were pursuing is they were pursuing a better tomorrow for themselves and more transparent political process. But if we are to speculate on the outcomes of the events at hand, definitely the Mubarak administration and people from Mubarak cohort are very influencing over the situation in Egypt. So definitely they will be pursuing their ends and promoting their candidates in order to at least secure their position within the Egyptian society. Because a lot of Egyptians, from what we see here, from what we observe, a lot of Egyptians are looking at the developments of this situation, at the current scenario, and they do not like what they see.
Reem, you wanted to get back in there.
I just wanted to question this idea that Egypt had no formulated civil society. I think Egypt's 2011 revolution was, of course, an extraordinary moment, but it was also the culmination of 4 decades of continuous mobilization, different waves of, but protest movement on a national scale that involved vibrant civil society. Civil society dates back definitely before that, but if we just look at the last 4 decades, that was the seeds of Tahrir. That was all the labor protests, the labor movement, the student movement, the women's groups, the cross-political coalitions that you had that were extremely important and crossed over from the middle to the poorer classes, like the movement for change, which was more famously known as Kifaya, or Enough, which challenged Mubarak and his succession plans with his son or his ideas of running again as early as 2004. I think civil society in Egypt is among the most vibrant and developed, and we need to start talking about the Arab uprisings with accurate concepts, and only then can we really get to the nitty-gritty of what's going on. I'm not sure all the voters are looking for this idea of stability, or we at least should problematize what we mean by stability, because that, of course, is the buzzword of the SCAF, of the ruling military council, this idea that the revolution has brought us chaos and is threatening our security, our economy. They talk about the production wheel, that's their other big phrase, and that we need to sort of rein in all this confusion. And in fact, if you look, as Amr was saying, the largest block of voters in the elections voted for change, voted for Hamdin Sabahi, who came in actually third and by all measures really should have been second because of the violations that we know, or many of us believe, that favoured Shafiq. And that bloc is quite happy to continue with this struggle to change Egypt, which everyone knows is going to be choppy waters. But nobody is willing to go back to what the Mubarak era would have called stability, which only meant working extremely hard for low wages for the large majority of Egyptians, having no representation, no culpability when you are either disenfranchised or in any other way compromised in your social and working life, in the name of this national stability myth.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at Egypt's presidential election. I'm joined by Nabila Ramdani, the journalist and commentator, Reem Abou El-Fadl, a research fellow from Oxford University, Ilya Fabrichnikov, an independent analyst over the line from Moscow, and Omar Ashur from Exeter University, who's joining us today from Cairo. Nabila, Reem was just talking there, saying that civil society in Egypt is vibrant, that Egyptians want change and they're voting for change. Do you agree with that? And how is it that they've ended up with these 2 candidates, one of them a sort of authoritarian secularist, and one of them also fairly authoritarian Islamist?
Egyptians are voting for change, but more crucially, they're voting for somebody who will be able to sort out the more pressing problems in Egyptian society, and that is the economy. 40% of Egyptians live below the poverty line. Youth unemployment in particular is a real concern. The tourism industry has been hardly hit because of the chaos triggered by the revolution. The country hasn't recovered yet. And whoever is elected will have to deal with the stake of the economy. Ahmed Shafiq, Mubarak's latest prime minister, played up the military card throughout his campaign. He very much portrayed himself as the law and order man. He's, of course, an ex-Air Force commander. He has very strong credentials in the military, and he made it clear he was the man to restore stability and a sense of law and order to the country. Mohammed Morsi is very much capitalizing on the formidable results of the Muslim Brotherhood at the latest parliamentary elections. And I would contend that it's no coincidence that in a Muslim-majority country, where an organization like the Muslim Brotherhood, with formidable networks across the country, has taken up the role of the states throughout 3 decades of dictatorship, ensuring the basic services of the state, transport, education, healthcare. It shouldn't be surprising that the Egyptian people actually trust that organization to do something with the country and turn in contributing in the new Egypt. What Mohammed Morsi has been trying to do, and I was in Egypt during the first round of the elections, and right after the first round, he was trying to form an alliance with Abu al-Futuh, an ex-Muslim Brotherhood, a moderate Islamist, and indeed with Hamdin Sabahi, a leftist, a Nasserite, who arrived third in the election, in order to diffuse, if you want, this overwhelming hand of the Muslim Brotherhood on the political life in Egypt. And it is true that young revolutionaries feel that they are somehow left without a viable candidate who represents the spirit of the revolution against the Mubarak era.
Omar, from what you are seeing in Egypt right now, is that what is motivating people? Getting the economy back on track, restoring stability, and putting food on the table?
It is partly motivating people, but it's not just that. People here want some kind of security also against the violations of the state or whoever hijacks the state. You ride with taxi drivers and they don't want the times where the police officer stop them, slap them and take some bribes from them and then frame an accusation and frame a crime for them. They don't want these times to come back. So they are very wary as well of the repressive nature of the state, and they don't want this to be back. This is a revolution that was sparked by police brutality, by two policemen beating a young man to death publicly, and those times are very sensitive for many of the Egyptians, especially the ones who suffered from the repressive nature. But as well, they want some kind of security coming. They don't want the thugs to be running the country, thugs between quotations, these militias of civilian-closed people carrying various kinds of arms. They don't want them to run the country, especially in impoverished areas. They want, of course, like anyone else, a better economy, better jobs, better education, better healthcare system. And until now, there is no magical solution except promises from both candidates. Mohammed Morsi is promising his project for Renaissance, between quotations. His electoral program is very much economy intensive, talking about foreign direct investments, talking about enhancing levels of healthcare and education. And Shafiq is saying the same thing as well. Both of them, are going to be very intensive on foreign direct investments, I think. But in the end, the voters do not want the time of Mubarak to come back, and they want this revolution to move forward, granting them security and a better, prosperous life.
Ilya, over in Moscow, I've got a question for you here. Back last year, at the beginning of 2011, when we were watching the revolution unfold in television sets here in the West, it looked very much like Egypt was headed for some kind of European-style social democracy. That, of course, isn't happening. It's not going in that direction at the moment exactly. I was wondering if, from Moscow, you thought perhaps that was because this European-style model just isn't that attractive anymore.
To my point of view, it is not the issue of the European-style democracy and social control over the political parties and political structures. It is, the point was very clear that the public gathered at Tahrir. They were bound for change, and the change itself was formulated in several very clear messages. So they wanted Mubarak out, they wanted justice, they wanted the fresh start. But here where the controversy is, you can't just install the Western-style democracy to the Middle Eastern country, to the North African country, because obviously the mentality is different. And while people are pursuing the idea of justice and the idea of democracy, the understanding of democracy is different because it is heavily influenced by traditional Islamic and Middle Eastern approaches to the way society works, to the way of connections within the society. So basically, we can't speak about the Western style of democracy because it's just not a Western country. What people were looking at, they were looking for a completely new approach to the way the state is working. And I think that Muslim Brothers had the ultimate answer to this question. That's why they succeeded in promoting their cause within the first month of the revolution and of the change. But we have to be clear that key power brokers within the society are still there. They haven't gone far. Because if Mubarak is serving his life sentence in jail, well, in my point of view, nothing really had affected a major shift in the Egyptian policy. But it's still a very long way to go to the proper meaning of the democracy, the proper meaning of the functionality of the civil structures within the Egyptian society. What we see now is an outrage because of the inability to see the instant changes, and we have to understand that changes cannot be instant. There was a very good point that economy problems come to the first plan. So definitely the one who will reach onto the society, who will understand their needs and who will formulate their slogans accordingly to the needs of the society. That one will be winning the election and will be leading the country further.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at Egypt's presidential election. I'm joined by Nabila Ramdani, the journalist and commentator, Reem Abu El Fadl, a research fellow from Oxford University, Ilya Fabrichnikov, an independent analyst over the line from Moscow, and joining us from Cairo is Omar Ashur from Exeter University. Reem, I'd like to turn to you at this stage because I think you might take umbrage at what some of Ilya was saying there. Central point being that you can have a European-style social democracy, but not in a country that's traditional and Islamist like Egypt is.
Definitely, it's a long discussion, but this idea of Western-style democracy is vague and essentialist at best. But I'll leave that aside for a second and talk about the nature of the Egyptian state. If you want to be very, historical and accurate about it, it's always been a secular state. It is not an Islamist-ruled state. In fact, being colonized by Britain, a lot of the law is actually, from the Western colonial eras, British and French law. Only family law is done by religion today in Egypt. And in fact, it's been possible for Hosni Mubarak, the dictator, to survive his 30 years because of a great deal of the backing, of Western backing, the backing of the so-called international community. So let's throw out discussions and dichotomies about, the Western-style liberal democracy and traditional Egypt or traditional Arab countries, because it's really simplistic to talk about one sort of political group in any country. Now, moving on to the demands of the Egyptian protesters, the two main slogans that came out of...
Can I just put one point in, though?
Yes.
And that is that from the parliamentary elections, 70% of the seats went to Islamists. I mean, that was Egyptians voting, expressing their democratic prerogative.
Absolutely. And in the recent first round, that proportion was halved, because this is a dynamic political field in which people make choices based on their own interests, and those interests change, and they make sort of rational choices. They're not following blindly the whatever the conception is of a traditional system. What we should talk about why the Islamists did so well in November, which is partly because, as we were saying earlier, they are one of the oldest, most organized groups in Egypt. They can mobilize networks across the country. They've been going since 1928, and we know that since the presidency of Sadat, who is the predecessor of Hosni Mubarak, who cemented Egypt's alliance with America, they were built up very purposely by the state so that they, would have opportunities to outmaneuver leftists and Nasrites who would have had a different attitude to social justice and social policy in the country. So, also with the failings of the recent administration, yes, the Muslim Brothers have been able to provide sort of this parastatal network sometimes with welfare in certain areas, but I don't think we should overplay that and then, describe the Egyptian people as mostly Islamist. In fact, if we could pay attention to the recent elections, we would see that, areas like Alexandria, which were traditionally pro-Islamist in the times of Mubarak, when certain other parameters were in place, voted for Hamdin Sabahi, the Nasrite, who was always very clear about national unity and the rights and equal rights of Christians and Muslims and the lack of differences between them. The visions for the economy of Shafiq and Morsi do not differ radically, I would say. The Renaissance Project is a neoliberal project, what he called the Renaissance Project. It's going for more privatization, all the sorts of projects that were working to make richer the very small proportion of very wealthy people in Egypt under Mubarak are being proposed to be continued. And that's also the case in the Shafiq campaign. And this is also coinciding with international financial institutions who are looking to Egypt and Tunisia now as not having changed at all. So you have, for example, the European Bank of Recovery and Development looking to begin operations for the first time ever in Tunisia and Egypt, and looking to privatize potable water, which is, not really listening to the lessons of the move for social justice that all of the Tahrir squares of Egypt made very clear last year. And so this idea that people will vote for either Shafiq or Morsi based on their visions of how much they say they will address the economy is only half the story, because I think people are very savvy and very aware that neither of them have the interests of the large majority of Egyptians at heart.
Nabila Ramdani, we're running out of time. Maybe I'll let you just get back in there to comment on anything that you'd like to about what Reem was saying. And perhaps wrapping up, you can indicate whether or not you think that after this weekend, there is any reason to think that Egypt will settle down to anything close to normality.
Well, first of all, if I may, Reem, calling Nasser's Egypt secular is a bit far-fetched. To ask the Egyptians. On paper it was, and it suited Western powers, but in reality, we all know that it wasn't, of course. And dare I say...
incidents of sectarian violence under Ahmed Nasser. It's a long discussion, but
ask Egyptians.
Okay, Nabila, go back to your point. Thank you.
The success of the Muslim Brotherhood is also due to the fact that it was demonized by the West, in the sense that especially in the wake of the 9/11 events, Arab countries and indeed Muslim countries, including Egypt, were sold that narrative, that black and white narrative, dare I say, meaning either you have your dictators and relative stability, or extremist Islamic groups will take over. And that, in the minds of Western powers, including moderate groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course they were pushed underground, they were repressed, crackdowns were taking place. And that increased their popularity on the ground. And the notion of the economy being at the heart of the presidential race is crucial. If you remember the slogans, the early slogans of protesters on Tahrir Square, they were shouting, Aish, Hurriya wa Haq, bread, freedom, and justice. Aish in colloquial Egyptians doesn't just mean bread, it also means life, which is the essence of the message of the demonstrators, to get their lives back in order. And that includes having bread on the table and get going with their lives. So fixing the economy is a major concern.
That was Nabila Ramdani, the journalist and commentator, saying that what's really going to motivate Egyptians when they go to the ballot box, electing their new president this weekend, is putting bread on the table. I was also joined by Reem Abu al-Fadl, a research fellow from Oxford University, Ilya Fabrichnikov, an independent analyst over the line from Moscow, and joining us from Cairo was Omar Ashur from Exeter University. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned for the latest update of what's making headlines around the world. Secularists or Coptic Christians. So, how did what appeared to be a liberal secular revolution end up like this? Is the Mubarak state really a thing of the past? And what is in Egypt's future? To probe these questions, we're hosting a discussion in our London studio. I'm joined by Nabila Ramdani, the journalist and commentator, Reem Abu al-Fadl, a research fellow from Oxford University, Ilya Fabrichnikov, an independent analyst on the line from Moscow, and Omar Ashur from Exeter University, who's joining us today from Cairo. Okay, to get the ball rolling, I'd like to get a single sentence answer from each of you to the following question. You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at Egypt's presidential election. A cartoon in an Egyptian newspaper shows a perplexed family huddled in front of a television set. Written on the screen is a phrase that perhaps sums up the national mood. It says, "We wish to inform our dear viewers that we don't understand what is happening either."
That there has been a sign that the Egyptian public is not satisfied with the results of both revolution and the election protest, and obviously that the appearance of the former Mubarak administration figure is definitely the reflection of those controversies within the Egyptian society.
And Omar, you're in Cairo. What's the latest from there? What do you think about this?
In Cairo, I think it's the ultimate say has to be to the Egyptian people as well. The Egyptians, I think, 16 million voted for pro-change, whether for revolutionary change or for pro-change Islamist candidate like Dr. Mohammed Morsi. So the overwhelming majority voted revolution, voted change.
First of all, from you, Nabila, who should be Egypt's next president and why?
It will make sense to the Egyptian people that a former member of the Mubarak regime, which have obviously strong ties with the old structure, should not be representative of the new Egypt.
And Reem?
I don't think we're in a position to say who the next president should be because the people haven't been asked properly. And we need to restart not only the electoral process, but actually the so-called transition to find out. Definitely the indications are that it's neither Shafiq nor Morsi.
And Elia?
Definitely it's for Egyptian people to decide. But what we're witnessing here is a rift between different political parties.
That nobody knows what is going on, and nobody has a clue what the hell is coming next. 16 months after the Tahrir Square protests began and Egyptian politics appears far from revolutionary. Sure, ousted President Hosni Mubaraks is now serving a life sentence and decades of emergency rule have come to an end. But many Egyptians are disappointed with the two candidates who have made it to this weekend's runoff presidential vote. One is the Mubarak-era military figure, Ahmed Shafiq, who promises security and leadership that is reminiscent of the dictatorship years. The other candidate is the Muslim Brotherhood's Mohammed Morsi. He's clearly not the first choice for many women.